In the spring of 1879, in the high country above the Madison River in the Montana Territory, a woman of 28 stood in the mud of a freight yard and held in her two hands a brass compass that did not point north. The men who had given it to her were already laughing. They had laughed when she asked what was left in the lot, and they laughed harder when the clerk reached into a crate of dead men's effects and set the compass in her palm as though it were a joke they had been saving. The needle swung loose and lay still at a bearing no one could name. It was, they told her, a broken thing off a dead surveyor, worth less than the tin it was housed in, and she was welcome to it for nothing at all. Her name was Della Hart. She did not laugh with them. She turned the compass over once, felt the small irregular weight of it, and read the initials scratched into the back plate with a tool that had not been a jeweler's. She had seen those initials before. She put the compass in the pocket of her apron, thanked the clerk in a voice that carried no resentment, and walked out into the rain. What she did not yet know was that the needle was not broken at all, and that the man who had filed it into lying had done so on purpose, and that following its lie across 40 miles of country would bring her to a thing 3 powerful men had spent 11 years pretending did not exist. This is a story about a thing the world threw away, and about a woman patient enough to ask why a dead man would carry a compass that lied. If it stays with you, there are others like it waiting at the end. The rain comes first, though, and the freight yard, and the long road back to who Della Hart had been before the world, decided she was nothing. She had come to the territory 4 years earlier as the ward and apprentice of an old instrument maker named Josiah Webb, who had kept a narrow shop in a mining town that no longer had a name worth printing, Tat. Webb had repaired the precise and delicate machinery on which the frontier secretly ran. He mended the theodolites, the survey crews bent against rock, the chronometers the freight masters trusted with their schedules, the barometers, the sextants carried west by men who would never see an ocean again, and above all the compasses, hundreds of them brought to him fouled with iron filings and dropped in rivers and cracked across their faces. He had taught Della that an instrument never lied of its own accord. An instrument only ever told the truth it had been built or forced to tell. He was dead now. He had died in the second winter, quietly, in the chair by the bench, with a half-cleaned aneroid barometer open in front of him, and his spectacles pushed up on his forehead. Della had buried him herself in ground she had to thaw with coals before the shovel would bite, and she had inherited everything he owned, which amounted to a chest of fine tools, a head full of his exacting method, and a reputation among men who would not hire a woman of being nobody at all. The shop had failed within the year, not because her work was poor, but because the men who brought instruments to be mended would not leave them with her. They took one look at the young woman behind the dead man's bench and carried their broken theodolites to a saddler 40 miles off, who knew nothing of optics but who was, at least, a man. She had closed the shop, sold what she could not carry, and taken work where she could find it, mending watches in the back rooms of stores that would not put her name in the window, cleaning the brass fittings of lamps, and once, for a long, humiliating month, scrubbing the floors of a survey company's territorial office in the town of Ashford, while the men whose instruments she could have rebuilt blind stepped over her bucket as though she were part of it. It was that office that had given her the compass, not as charity. The survey company had folded a smaller outfit, bought its debts, and was selling the dead stock at auction to recover pennies on the dollar, and the lot of personal effects, the unclaimed belongings of men who had died in the field and left no one to claim them, was the cheapest lot of all. Della had gone because tools turned up in such lots, and good tools could be cleaned and sold. She had not expected to find a compass with Josiah Webb's own initials filed into the back. She knew his mark the way she knew her own hand. He signed his repairs with a small J and a small W struck close together, low on the backplate, with a particular slip in the W where his graver had always caught. This compass carried that mark. Webb had worked on it. And Webb had been dead 3 years. which meant the compass had passed through his shop before she ever came to the territory, and had then traveled a long way to end up in a crate of dead men's effects in Ashford, still carrying the lie he had put into it. Because it did lie. She established that the first night, by candle, at the table in the boarding-house room she rented by the week. She set the compass on a sheet of paper marked where the needle settled, then carried it to the window and to the door and to the iron stove, and watched it settle each time at the same wrong bearing. Indifferent to the actual north, she could read off the pole star through the glass. A broken compass wandered. A demagnetized needle drifted and could not hold. This needle held. It held firmly and consistently at a false reading, which is not the behavior of a broken instrument at all. It is the behavior of an instrument that has been deliberately and skillfully altered to point somewhere other than north, and to go on pointing there with all the steadiness of an honest tool. Webb had taught her how it was done years ago as a curiosity rather than a craft. A second small magnet, set into the body of the case at a calculated angle, would pull the needle off true by a fixed amount so that the compass became a private cipher. A man could walk a false bearing in plain sight of his companions, his instrument apparently sound, and arrive at a place none of them could find by following him, because the error was constant and known only to the man who had filed it in. Webb had called it a liar's needle, and had said no honest surveyor would own one. Whoever had carried this had not been honest or had not been free. Della spent 2 days determining the size of the lie. This was not guesswork. She removed the back plate with Webb's own jeweler's screwdriver, found the second magnet exactly where his method said it would be, a sliver of lodestone no longer than a grain of barley seated in beeswax against the inner wall, and she measured the deflection it produced against a sound compass she trued by the sun. The liar's needle ran 22 degrees east of true, constantly, in every position. Whoever had walked by it had been walking 22 degrees off the bearing he appeared to walk. To follow him, you did not need his secret. You needed only his compass and the knowledge that it lied and the patience to correct for it. She might have left it there. She might have cleaned the compass, sold it as a curiosity to a collector of frontier oddments, and used the money to eat for a month. That she did not is the whole of her character. Webb had filed that lie into the brass with his own hand, and Webb did not do dishonest work for dishonest men without reason, and the man who had carried it had died in a field with no one to claim his body. 3 facts, and Della Hart could not let them lie unexamined any more than Webb could have left a fouled chronometer ticking wrong on his bench. She wanted to know where the needle pointed. She wanted to know what it had been built to find, or to hide. The dead man had a name. The auction clerk, when she pressed him with the small courtesy that costs nothing and opens most doors, found the lot record in his ledger and read it to her without much caring. The personal effects had belonged to a surveyor named Amos Crane, who had died of exposure in the back country 11 years before in the winter of 1868, while in the employ of a survey contract let by a man named Sefton. The name meant nothing to the clerk. It meant a great deal in Ashford. Halloran Sefton was the largest landholder in 3 counties, a man who had come into the territory poor and was now rich, and whose wealth had been built. Everyone agreed, and no one could prove, on land he had surveyed himself in the years when there was no one to check a surveyor's word. Della began to understand the shape of the thing, though not yet its size. A surveyor in Sefton's employ had carried a compass deliberately altered to lie by a fixed amount. That surveyor had died alone in the back country in 1868, and Sefton had grown rich on the strength of surveys from exactly those years, surveys that placed boundaries and section corners and the all-important mineral claims wherever the recorded bearings said they fell. If the bearings had been walked with a liar's needle, then the lines on Sefton's filed maps lay 22 degrees off the lines a man had actually walked on the ground. The maps were a fiction. and somewhere out in the country at the place the true bearings actually led, lay whatever Amos Crane had been sent to find and had been made to misreport. She did not go to the law. She had no standing with the law, and the law in Ashford ate from Sefton's hand besides. She went instead to the one place where the dead surveyor's true intentions might still be written down, which was the territorial recorder's office where the field notes of old surveys were filed and forgotten. For the price of a half-day's wages, she was permitted to sit in the cold back room and turn the brittle pages of the 1868 books, and there, in a hand cramped by cold and hurry, she found Amos Crane's field notes for the survey of a tract along a tributary of the Madison that the maps called Sefton's North Range. The notes were a riddle until she held the compass beside them. Crane had recorded his bearings honestly in his private notebook, the bearings he actually walked, and then she saw the official plat filed under the same survey carried different bearings entirely, every one of them shifted by the same 22 degrees. She laid the two open on the cold table in the recorder's back room, the brittle official plat with its clerkly inked lines and the cramped pencil of the field book, and she went down them line by line with the compass beside her hand, and the pattern was as plain and as damning as a row of figures that would not sum. North Range, section by section. Every recorded bearing in the filed record sat 22 degrees clockwise of the bearing the field books swore the surveyor had walked. Crane had walked true and reported false. Or rather, Crane had walked by his liar's needle, recorded what the needle told him in his private notes so that he himself could find his way back, and someone else had taken those notes and filed a plat that made the lie permanent. The compass in her pocket was the key that turned the private notebook back into a map of the real ground. A clerk passed behind her once and glanced at the old books and saw only a woman copying figures she could not possibly need, and went on, and Della let him go on thinking it and copied faster. Here is the moment to say plainly what was at stake, because the people who watched a young woman copy old field notes in a cold room did not see it, and you should. A lie 22 degrees wide, walked across 11 years and filed into the permanent record of an entire range of country, had moved every boundary on Sefton's land away from where it truly sat. The question Della carried out of that room was simple and enormous. What lay at the place the true bearings led, that a rich man had paid a surveyor to walk past and call empty? She spent the last of her ready money on a mule, a wall tent, a month of flour and bacon and coffee, and the loan of a pack saddle, and she went to find out. She also took, because Webb had taught her never to trust a single instrument, a sound compass trued by the sun, a chain for measuring distance, and the dead man's notebook copied out in her own clear hand. The mule she named Crane, after the man whose honest private notes were guiding her. A small grim joke she allowed herself, and no one else. The men of Ashford who noticed her leaving assumed she had given up and gone back east, and wished her a good riddance they did not bother to lower their voices over. One of Sefton's foremen, a heavy, affable man named Pruitt, saw her at the livery and asked, smiling, whether she was off to seek her fortune, and Della said only that she was going to do some survey work, which was true, and which Pruitt found so funny that he repeated it to the other men, who agreed that the floor-scrubbing woman calling herself a surveyor was the best thing they had heard all month. The story reached Sefton himself by the end of the week, and Sefton, who had not stayed rich by laughing at things, did not laugh. The country Crane's notes led her into was not the country the maps described, and that was the first proof that she was right. Following the liar's needle and correcting each bearing by 22 degrees, walking the chain out behind the mule across 40 miles of foothill and timber, she came on the third day to a fold of ground the official plat showed as a featureless slope of Sefton's North Range. The work of it was slow, past any patience a watching man would have credited. She would set the compass, read the lying bearing, swing the correction 22 degrees by the brass protractor Webb had taught her to use, sight a tree or a rock on the true line, and walk the chain to it, 66 feet at a pull, driving a willow pin at each chain's end and tallying the pins in a knot of cord at her belt, the way the chainman did, because a bearing without a distance is only a direction, and she meant to arrive at a place and not merely point at one. By the third day her hands had split at the knuckles from the cold in the chain, and she wrapped them in strips torn from a flour sack and went on. And where the corrected line ran she found not the open slope of the map, but a narrow box canyon. The maps did not acknowledge at all. Its mouth screened by a stand of lodgepole pine that a surveyor walking the false bearing would have passed a quarter-mile to the south and never seen. The maps had been drawn so that no honest line ever came near this place. Crane had drawn them that way on purpose, leaving the truth folded into a private notebook for someone with patience enough to unfold it. In the canyon, half overtaken by 11 years of brush and the slow work of frost, stood the thing Amos Crane had died beside. It was a stamp mill, a small one, the iron heart of a mining operation. Its battery of ore-crushing stamps frozen with rust in their frames, its timber housing silvered and sagging, its flume collapsed into the creek it had once diverted. Around it lay the bones of a camp, and cut into the canyon wall behind the mill, shored with rotting timber and chained shut across its mouth, with a length of trace chain gone to red lace, was the dark mouth of a mine. She stood a long time at the mouth of that canyon and let herself understand it. This was the place the bearings truly led. This was the thing the 22-degree lie had been built to hide. A working mine, a stamp mill to crush its ore, a whole concern, sitting on ground that Sefton's filed maps swore was empty slope. Someone had found a paying mine, surveyed the country around it so that the official record placed every line a quarter-mile off, and the mine itself nowhere at all, and then, she suspected, made very sure the only man who knew the true bearings did not come back to walk them again. The labor of the days that followed was the labor of an instrument maker turned to a larger machine, and Della went at it the only way Webb had ever permitted, which was slowly and in order, and with respect for the thing's own construction. She did not force the chained at it on the first day or the second. She cleared the brush from the mill first, working with the head of the camp's rusted axe, rehafted on a green pole, cutting back 11 years of chokecherry and snowberry that had grown up through the mill floor until the iron of the battery stood clear in the morning light. She read the machine the way she would have read a fouled chronometer, learning what it had been before she touched what it had become. The stamps were 5, in a single battery, each a heavy iron shoe on an oak stem, and from the wear on the dies, she could see the mill had run and run hard before it stopped. She measured the cams that had lifted them and found them honed smooth on their working faces, the polish of a machine that had cycled 10,000 times and 10,000 more. She found the mortar boxes packed with a gray paste of crushed rock and rust, where the last charge had never been washed out, and when she scraped a thumbnail of it clean and wetted in the creek and tilted it to the light, she saw the dull pale gleam that even an instrument maker who had never assayed an ounce in her life could not mistake for nothing. The mill had been crushing pay rock the day it stopped. This had not been a prospect that came to nothing. This had been a producing mine, shut down not because the ore failed, but because the man who owned the secret of its location chose to close the door and walk away rich, with the law's own maps to swear the place did not exist. Webb's voice came to her across 3 years in the cold of that canyon, the thing he had said over every instrument that arrived, looking ruined and proved only neglected. A thing is not broken, he had told her, until you have understood it and found it past mending. Most things men call broken are only things no one troubled to read. She had thought, when he said it, that he meant compasses. Standing in the frozen mill, she understood he had meant a good deal more. She found the camp's tools where 11 winters had left them. A single jack hammer and a set of drill steels gone to rust in a rotted leather roll. A shovel, the head of an axe. She found, in the collapsed remains of a slab shanty, an iron strong box with its lid sprung, empty of money, but not empty. For inside, wrapped in oilcloth, gone stiff and dark, lay a bundle of papers that the cold, dry air of the canyon had preserved better than any vault. And she found, which stopped her hands for a full minute, a second notebook in the same cramped hand as the field notes, Amos Crane's own, the last pages dated in the December of 1868. The chained adit she came to last on the fourth day because it was the hardest thing, and Webb had taught her to leave the hardest thing until the easy work had told her what to expect of it. The trace chain across its mouth had rusted into a single fused ribbon, and she did not try to break it, which would have meant force, and force was Sefton's tool, not hers. She worked instead at the staple that held it, a hand-forged iron pin driven into a timber gone soft with rot, and she wet the wood for an evening and a morning with creek water carried in a tin, and worked the pin loose with the single jack and a drill steel for a cold chisel, a quarter-inch at a stroke, until the rotten timber gave up its grip on the iron, and the whole chained ribbon swung down into the brush with a sound like a struck bell muffled in earth. Behind it, the deep-breathed out air that had been sealed in the mountain for 11 years, colder than the canyon and smelling of wet stone and old powder smoke. And she stood in that breath a moment before she struck a light. She read those pages by firelight that night, with the mule cropping brush behind her and the frozen stamps standing black against the stars, and they told the rest of it in the plain, exhausted words of a man who knew he was not going to be paid for his honesty. Crane had been hired by Sefton to survey the North Range. He had found the canyon and the outcrop and had assayed it himself and known it for a fortune in silver-bearing ore. He had reported it as an honest surveyor must, and Sefton had made him an offer, which was that Crane would file a plat, moving every line off true by a fixed bearing, would carry a compass altered to that same bearing, so that any man who checked his work in the field would find it consistent, and would in exchange hold a quiet share in the mine. Crane had taken the offer. The notebook did not pretend otherwise. He had carried Webb's liar's needle, filed to Sefton's bearing by an instrument maker who was told only that a gentleman wished his compass adjusted, and he had walked the country false and grown, for a season, quietly rich. Then the share had not been paid. Sefton had worked the mine through a foreman and a crew bound to silence by wages no honest work could match, had taken out the ore and crushed it at the hidden mill, and freighted the bullion out by night along the false bearing where no road was marked, and when Crane came in the winter of 1868 to claim what he was owed, he had been sent back out into the country on a fool's errand and had not been allowed to come in again. The last pages of the notebook were the notes of a man rationing his strength against a cold he could read in his own failing hand. The final entry was not bitter. It was a surveyor's entry. It gave the true bearing and distance from the mill mouth to the spot where he had cached his proof, in case any honest soul should ever find his liar's needle and think to ask it where north truly lay. Della found the cache the next morning, the bearing run off the mill mouth with the corrected compass, and the chain walked out exactly as the dead man's last honest measurement directed, under a flat stone at the foot of a lightning-split pine. It held the assay certificate in Crane's name, the original signed contract in which Halloran Sefton agreed to a 1/5 share in consideration of a survey filed at a stated false bearing, and a letter, never sent, addressed to the Territorial Surveyor General, laying the whole fraud out in the cramped, clear hand of a man who had decided too late to be honest and had died before he could be. It was everything. It was the mine, the lie, the bearing, the contract, and the confession. Sealed 11 years in the cold, dry dark of a canyon, the map swore was empty, waiting for the one instrument that could find it to be sold for nothing, to the one person patient enough to ask it the right question. She did not feel triumph. Webb had taught her that an instrument feels nothing when it finally reads true, that the satisfaction belongs to the hand that trued it, and not to the brass. She felt instead the grave particular weight of being the only living person who knew, and the certainty that knowing was not the same as proving, and that proving against a man like Sefton would take more than a dead surveyor's notebook and a compass that lied. It would take the law standing somewhere Sefton's hand could not reach, and it would take the truth being told in a way that could not be quietly bought back into the dark. She did not go back to Ashford. She understood that the recorder's office in Ashford was Sefton's ground, that the field notes she had copied could vanish from the 1868 books between one cold morning and the next, and that a woman walking into a Sefton county with a strong box of proof was a woman who might never walk out. She went instead the long way south and west, 11 days with the mule, to the territorial capital, where the Surveyor General kept the master plats for the whole territory and answered, at least in principle, to authorities further off than Halloran Sefton's money reached. The midpoint of any honest labor is the moment the work is done and the world has not yet been made to believe it. And that was the cold office Della walked into with 11 years of frost still in her clothes. If you have ever held a true thing in your hands and been told by comfortable men that it could not be so, you will know the country she crossed in that room better than any map could show it. She set the contract on the Surveyor General's desk and the assay certificates, and Crane's 2 notebooks, the false official plat and the honest private bearings, side by side. And she set down last of all the compass, and she showed a skeptical clerk and then a less skeptical deputy, the Surveyor General himself, how a sliver of lodestone the size of a barley grain had moved an entire range of country 22 degrees off true, and made a rich man richer on land that was never measured where he swore it was. It did not happen quickly. Truth carried in from the back country by a woman no one had heard of moved slowly through the offices of careful men. The first clerk she met would not look past her travel-stained coat and told her the Surveyor General saw no one without an appointment made by letter from a party of standing, and Della said, in the level voice she had learned at Webb's bench when a man came in certain that a young woman could not have mended his chronometer, that she would wait, and she sat on the hard bench in the cold hall through that day, and most of the next, with the strong box on her knees, until a deputy named Hollis, passing through on some other errand, stopped because no one waits 2 days on a bench for nothing, and asked her what she had. She did not make a speech. She opened the box and laid the false plat and the honest private bearings side by side on the deputy's own desk, and let him see with his own eyes and his own knowledge of bearings that the two could not both be true. That was all it took with Hollis. Bearings do not argue. The proof, however, was of a kind that careful men cannot finally ignore, because it was physical, and it was checkable, and it did not depend on her word at all. She showed a skeptical clerk, and then the less skeptical Hollis, and then at length the Surveyor General himself how a sliver of lodestone the size of a barley grain had moved an entire range of country 22 degrees off true, and made a rich man richer on land that was never measured where he swore it was. She set the compass on the Surveyor General's desk and trued a sound compass beside it by the sun through the south window, and let the old man watch the 2 needles disagree by the exact amount the filed plats disagreed with Crane's private book. The Surveyor General was a careful man who had spent 40 years believing the records in his own vault, and Della watched him understand slowly and without pleasure that some unknown portion of those records were a lie a dead man had been paid to write. He asked her one question, which was who she was. She told him she was an instrument maker taught by Josiah Webb, and that she had been given the compass for nothing because everyone agreed it was broken. The Surveyor General looked at the small brass lyre a long moment, and said, in the voice of a man revising a great deal at once, that it appeared to be the soundest instrument in the building. The Surveyor General sent his own party north under the Deputy Hollis, who owed Sefton nothing with sound instruments and Crane's true bearings, and they walked the corrected lines and found the canyon exactly where the dead man's honest needle said it would be, and the stamp mill, and the chain adit, and the bones of the camp, all on ground the filed plat called Empty Slope. After that, there was nothing for the careful men to argue with. The ground itself had testified. Halloran Sefton was never met in any final confrontation, because that is not how such men end. He was not arrested in a dramatic scene, nor brought low in a courtroom by a ringing speech. He was simply slowly undone by the weight of his own filed records, once they were laid against the true ground. The survey patents he held voided one by one as the resurvey advanced, the title to the hidden mine and a good deal of the land around it reverting to the territory, and then passing to those who could show an honest claim. His foreman, Pruitt, faced with a contract bearing his witness mark, remembered a great many things he had spent 11 years forgetting. Sefton sold what he could and left the county where he had been a great man to become, somewhere further west, a man with money and no name, which for him was the nearest thing to ruin the world had to offer. Della did not watch him go. She had no interest in his face. She had only ever been interested in the truth the brass had been forced to tell. What she did care about, and what she went back into the high country to do, when the resurvey was finished and the records set right, was the matter of Amos Crane, who had died alone in the cold because he had told a lie, and then could not be allowed to unsay it. The territorial authorities, presented with the unsent letter and the honest cash, recorded Crane's confession as what closed the case, and Della asked, as the only thing she ever asked for herself out of the whole affair, that the surveyor be allowed a marked grave. They found his bones where his last entry said they would be, a half-mile from the mill along the true bearing he had walked, trying to come in. She buried him properly in the canyon he had died trying to expose, and set over him a plain stone. And on it, because she would not pretend he had been only honest or only false, she had cut the single word that was the truest thing she could say of any man who had been both. It said, "Surveyor, the share Crane had been promised and never paid did not die with him. The contract was specific, and the law, once it stood on ground Sefton could not buy, was specific in return. A 1/5 interest in a producing mine, 11 years of withheld value behind it, came at last to the surveyor's estate, and Amos Crane had left it turned out, a sister in Ohio and through her a niece, a schoolteacher named Ada Crane, who had never met her uncle and had grown up believing him a man who had simply vanished west and shamed the family by it. Della went to Ohio herself because some things should not be done by letter, and put into the schoolteacher's hands the proof that her uncle had been a man who did wrong and then died trying to make it right, and the documents that made her, against every expectation of her ordinary life, the holder of a true and recorded claim to a real mine in the Montana Territory. Ada Crane wept, and Della did not, and the two women sat a long while at a kitchen table in Ohio with the contract and the notebooks between them, the false plat and the honest bearings, while a clock that Della's hands itched to open and clean ticked slightly wrong on the wall. It was the only time in the whole affair that Della came near to weeping herself, and it was not for the mine, or the money, or the vindication. It was for the dead instrument maker who had filed the lie, and the dead surveyor who had carried it, two careful men in their graves, and for the long cold patience that the truth had been made to keep before a hand came along that would ask it to speak. She did not become rich. She took for her part only what the Surveyor General's office paid her for the resurvey work she had in fact performed, a surveyor's wage for a surveyor's labor, the first honest wage the territory had ever paid her under her own name. Ada Crane, who had a schoolteacher's good sense and no wish to run a mine from Ohio, sold her interest to an honest concern, and settled a sum on the woman who had crossed half the country to bring her the truth, and Della took that too, because Webb had also taught her that there is no virtue in refusing what is fairly owed. With it she did the only thing she had ever wanted to do, which was to open a shop again, in the territorial capital this time, a narrow shop with her own name in the window where it could not be taken down, and a bench, and the chest of Josiah Webb's fine tools, and a sign that said simply that instruments were repaired within, by a maker who had been taught by the best the territory ever had, The men who had laughed in the freight yard in Ashford did not, on the whole, come to apologize, because men of that kind seldom do, and Della did not need them to. The work came, though, which was the only acknowledgment she had ever wanted, the survey crews and the freight masters and the mining engineers bringing their fouled and broken instruments to the woman who had read an entire fraud out of a compass everyone else had thrown away, and leaving them with her, and coming back, and trusting the name in the window. A man does not have to say he was wrong if he is willing at last to leave his theodolite on your bench. The truth of the matter had been settled on the ground, where truth in that country was always settled in the end, and the ground does not require apologies. The compass she kept. She never sold it, though collectors came to ask, and once a museum man from the East offered a sum that would have kept the shop a year. She kept it on the bench where she could see it, the liar's needle with the sliver of lodestone still seated in its beeswax exactly where Webb had set it, because she had decided not to true it. Trued? It was only one more honest compass among the thousands she would mend in her life. Left as it was the truest thing she owned, a brass instrument built to lie that had in the one hand patient enough to ask it the right question, told the largest truth of all. On winter evenings, when the shop was closed and the lamp was down to its last good hour, she would sometimes take it up and set it on the sheet of paper where she had first proved it false, and watch the needle settle, firm and certain, at its old wrong bearing 22 degrees east of north. It pointed, as it had always pointed, away from the truth, and straight at the thing the truth was hidden behind. She had only had to know it was lying, and to care enough to follow the lie all the way down to where it kept what no one was ever meant to find. The needle held. It always held. And Della Hart, who had been given nothing and made of it everything, would put the lamp out and leave the small brass lyre pointing faithfully into the dark, keeping, the way the dead keep, the one bearing that had finally been allowed to come true. Where would your patience have given out, on the road that everyone told you led nowhere? If a story of a dismissed woman and the thing she would not stop asking about is one you would sit with again, there are more of them waiting, each built on the same quiet faith that the world throws away exactly the things that hold the proof.